Well, welcome those of you who are arriving for the lecture, and for those who are joining us online across the country for our 2022 Durnbaugh lecture. I'm Steve Nault, and so glad that each of you could join us this evening here in the Susquehanna Room or wherever you are online. The Durnbaugh Lectures were established in 1993, and they honor the scholarly work of Hedda and Donald Durnbaugh by bringing to campus distinguished scholars in Anabaptist and Pietist studies. We're delighted this evening to have Hedda Durnbaugh with us, seated here along with her son, Chris. Don and Hedda are, of course, remarkable figures in Brethren history, theology, and hymnody. Until his death in 2005, Don Durnbaugh was a leading historian of Pietism, of the Brethren tradition, as well as the history of pacifism and ecumenism and other areas. Hedda is a distinguished musicologist and bibliographer. Both were instrumental in the early years of the Young Center's programming and development. And it's with Hedda's contributions in the area of music and bibliography that it's doubly fitting that I introduce tonight's Durnbaugh lecturer, librarian and curator Joe A. Springer, who will share recent scholarship on the earliest hymnals published by German-speaking Anabaptists in the 16th century. Springer has served as curator of the Mennonite Historical Library in Goshen, Indiana at Goshen College since 1986. He holds degrees in history from Goshen College and also a Master of Arts degree in history and a Master of Library Science from Catholic University in America. He enjoys studying the bibliographic evolution of specific works, as well as the interconnections among different kinds of works. And in his role at the Mennonite Historical Library, Springer regularly fields questions related to printing history, hymnody, and genealogy. Those who are here in person at the Susquehanna Room have had the opportunity to see the remarkable treasure that Joe brought with him here to my right, the only surviving copy of the 1564 edition of Etliche, schöne, Christliche Geseng, or better known in its later editions as the Ausbund, an early Anabaptist hymnal still used among the Old Order Amish today. My pleasure to introduce Joe Springer and his Durnbaugh lecture, That I May Sing, Early Anabaptist Hymnals. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to the Young Center and Elizabethtown College for inviting me to deliver this year's Durnbaugh lecture. I've profited from the work and research of both Hedda and the late Donald Durnbaugh, and I'm grateful to have had several opportunities over the decades for direct personal interaction with each of them. I'm pleased to offer comments this evening on the Anabaptist hymnody of the 16th century in the presence of Hedda, herself a scholar of hymnody. Sometime after August of 1535, Hans Betz, imprisoned at the Oberhaus Fortress in Passau, now just inside Germany, across from Austria, asked God for wisdom, so dass ich ein Lied mög singen, that I may sing a song. Betz's request and God's granting of that request are both documented in the first lines of the first hymn included in the collection that stars in this evening's event. We know of no earlier edition and no other copy of this 1564 printing of Etliche, schöne, Christliche Geseng, some beautiful Christian songs. In 1583, most of this collection was combined as the second part of another group of hymns bearing the title Ausbund. Now, almost 460 years later, these Passau songs, including Betz's request for wisdom, continue through the Ausbund to be in regular use in Old Order Amish worship services with new printings issued each year by the Amish of Lancaster County. That's actually contributed a dozen texts to the original 53-song collection. But as we know, the events of the 16th century renewal of Western European Christianity led to hundreds of new songs. Yes, there were some reformers whose rejection of the Catholic Mass included, initially at least, a rejection of any use of music. Indeed, among some of the earliest Zurich Anabaptists in 1520s, there were some who shared this rejection for at least a while. Other reformers chose to restrict their singing to biblical psalm texts. By 1524, Martin Luther and other German Protestants had begun issuing collections of new hymns. We have today several Anabaptist hymn texts, which, if attributed correctly, also were written already in the 1520s. The beautiful Christian songs of Passau, though, printed only after some delay, are solid evidence that the writing, and therefore we must believe also the singing, of songs was valued at least by some Anabaptists of the 1530s. Evidence of Anabaptist song texts and Anabaptist borrowing of the texts of other Christians grows throughout the 16th century. Just what was the first Anabaptist collection of hymns? That is harder to answer than we may like. There is an astoundingly low survival rate of even known Anabaptist hymnals. Those we know of are rarely clearly identified and often bear no publication date. Content of early Protestant hymnals more often than not, early Protestant hymnals more often than not seem to have focused more on using available hymns in the language of choice rather than checking the confessional boundaries of often anonymous text authors. We must remain somewhat cautious in our attributions and our dating of firsts. I'm reasonably sure that in addition to whatever song pamphlets may have been circulating before 1564, the decade of the 1550s had probably already produced both a Dutch language and a German language hymnal edited by Anabaptist-minded believers. I will return to these collections of the 1550s later this evening. But first, I want to introduce you to what is often called the 1564 Ausbund. From a bibliographical perspective, it is of course inaccurate to use the title Ausbund for this edition, so I'll call the edition the 1564 Passau Songs, asking you to remember that most of its content is solidly integrated into later editions of the hymnal called the Ausbund. First, I'll move backward from the present and then settle into the particulars of this collection of text being composed and later printed as a complete collection for the first time. And then I will offer some comments on other Anabaptist hymnals of the 16th century. Here you see the exterior of the binding that currently encases this rare edition. Around the year 1700, an unknown owner chose to bind the 1564 edition in the midst of several other essentially brand new song and prayer pamphlets dated 1696 and 1699. It was this fortuitous choice that allowed this sole copy to survive to the present. For almost 100 years now, this has been in the care of the Mennonite Historical Library at Goshen College. In 2015, we decided that this treasure deserved to be strengthened and prepared, we hope, for several more centuries of survival. With some trepidation, I packed up the book and shipped it to Jeff Peachy in New York City. Peachy is a very talented conservator who happens to have grown up a few blocks from our library. He carefully disassembled the entire volume, meticulously cleaned, repaired, and strengthened each leaf, and then reassembled the volume, so that we can handle and consult it with far less risk to its pages. If you want to read more about this, Peachy and Irvin Beck published an informative article in the October 2016 issue of Pennsylvania Mennonite Heritage. Here you see the volume before Peachy's excellent work. It was our choice not to disguise the many of the faults that had occurred to the binding in more than 3 centuries. What Peachy did was restore the binding to full working order and mitigate future risks that might occur in careful handling of the volume. What long had been in 2 pieces with the risk of falling further apart is now one sturdy unit. So the story of Goshen College's connection with the 1564 Passau songs begins down 283 here at James Lewis Hook, a antiquarian bookseller located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Harold S. Bender, a well-known Anabaptist historian and early promoter of the collecting of Anabaptist and Mennonite historical books, was visiting Harrisburg and leafing through things in his shop. He picked up the volume that he saw there and noticed that it had several pieces in it. And as he went back, the Passau songs were near the end of the volume, he discovered this unusual piece, a title that he recognized because the title of this book is the second part of the title of the Ausbund. So he knew there was a connection, and it was clearly dated 1564, which he knew was before the first known printed edition of the Ausbund. He didn't have a lot of money with him. The James Lewis Hook knew that the pieces, although together in one volume, were not bibliographically connected, and so offered to sell Bender the part he really wanted. So Bender paid the $10 for the part he really wanted and what he could afford at that point, and took with him the back part of this Sammelband, this collective binding. Fortunately for us, within a couple of years, Bender had remembered and sent more money for the rest of the volume. Unfortunately, we don't know whether at the time Bender first saw it, the pieces that were immediately preceding the Passau songs were already absent from the book, or whether they got sold somewhere in between. When we reassemble the volume, and you'll see a blank page beside the Passau songs title page, we don't know what was there because it would have been the owner's choice what to put there. There would have been no particular connection. So other than the fact of the binding itself, which because of the other pieces we suspect occurred right around the year 1700, and stylistically that fits too, there are really no further clues to this copy's journey between 1564 and 1928 other than geographic location. Since it was for sale in Harrisburg, we can assume that it likely came into eastern Pennsylvania with some Mennonite or Amish European immigrant in the 18th century. But for the unknown author who chose to include this booklet at a time when other more comprehensive editions of the Ausbund were available, we would not know the particulars of this 1564 Ausbund edition. We would know from the 1583 that such a collection probably existed, but we would not know when it was printed, not know its character. Let's return not just to 1564, but to 30 years earlier, to the Oberhaus Fortress in Passau, where the book's title tells us the prisoners wrote the 53 songs that are included here. Who was imprisoned, why, and when? Many of you in tonight's audience may be aware that 1525 is the year generally identified as the beginning of the Anabaptist movement. So we're 10 years after that point. We recognize, of course, that there were many and varied impulses of reforming activity sweeping particularly across German-speaking territories in the early 1520s. It's not my purpose tonight to go into all of those details and varieties of people who might be called Anabaptists, the rebaptizers, the Wiedertäufer at that time. What I will say very generally is that in the turmoil and mix of new ideas and changes in ecclesiastical and political structures of the day, there were disparate groups, some smaller, some larger, often taking hold first in urban settings, but also traveling into rural areas, who were seeking to practice newfound understandings of the Christian faith. Included were individuals convinced that they were discovering more authentic ways to live out their faith and seeking circles of like-minded believers. Rejection of infant baptism, often interest in non-resistance, a refusal to swear oaths, sometimes community of goods, were characteristics often found among some of these circles. Countering these were often both civil and religious power structures, sometimes working together, at other times themselves in conflict, but seeking control over ideas and practices that seemed destined to upset whatever status quo the powers wanted to maintain. In Passau, already in 1528, local authorities were caught off guard by the presence of what appeared to be a rapidly growing group of Anabaptist believers right in their jurisdiction. Using interrogation under torture, they identified and imprisoned as many individuals as they could, managing to wrangle recantations out of them. It was not these local Anabaptists, however, who in 1535 came to be imprisoned and generated, as we are told by the title page of this book, this particular group of hymns. A sprawling Holy Roman Empire united the patchwork of most German-speaking territories into a loose confederation. By the end of the 1520s, many rulers were becoming more concerned with cracking down on the religious heterodoxies flourishing in many places. The Edict of Speyer in April 1529 legitimized execution as a punishment for the heretics. Some other rulers at least began with a stance of greater toleration. Off towards the eastern borders of the empire, Moravia, at the far end of that red arrow, had several local rulers who welcomed Anabaptists and others into their territories. This toleration drew what were essentially religious refugees from areas where rulers had instituted harsh measures. Today, we particularly associate Moravia of the 16th century with the earliest Hutterites, a communal group of Anabaptists. But in fact, in the late 1520s and early 1530s, several large groups of Anabaptists were flourishing side by side in Moravia. These groups seem to have varied in specific practices enough that they were often distinguished using an identifier based on a leader's name. One such leader was Philip Planer, who had spent a number of years, 5 at least, working in various cities in sort of along the river and across even into Strasbourg. And he ended up in the city of Ustopetze, which the Germans knew as Auschwitz. And there he began to assemble like-minded individuals, probably reaching even the size of 400 adults by the summer of 1535. Religious and political turmoil continued to roil the comfort levels of those in power, and one particularly disturbing period of time was when a group of fairly radical, end times focused Anabaptists took over the city government of the town of Münster in Westphalia, much further north in Germany. And there, both Catholics and Lutheran powers laid siege to bring this threat to their existence to an end. And it was in the aftermath of this horror, the terror presented by the radical believers in Münster, that toleration became more difficult. And for the person who had been, the ruler who had been giving protection in Auschwitz, the time was over for protection. And Planer and his group, whom we retroactively call the Philippites, had to leave en masse, and they began looking for a new home. To do so, it's clear that they divided into smaller groups, making it easier to travel across land. And in many cases, those we can determine at least, there are not full records by any means on this, at least some of them seem to be returning to the places they had come from. For the people that in the summer of 1535 got captured in several different groups by the authorities in Passau, they likely were headed home to that blue area on the map over towards the Rhine River in what today would be southwestern Germany. In August and September of 1535, we have pretty secure knowledge that about 55, mostly adults, were arrested by authorities near Passau and imprisoned in the Oberhaus fortress. Among the names, there were several leaders who had been, as part of this dispersal from Auschwitz, Philipp Planer and his associate leader, Blasius Kuhn, had evidently ordained additional leaders to help lead these smaller groups. And several of these men were part of this group, including people like Hans Betz and Michael Schneider. Schneider becomes remembered in part for his several hymns in these Passau songs, but also because he at one point, probably around 1538, recanted and was released. The rest of his personal history is not entirely known, but it is possible, and perhaps this is a reason his hymns remain in the collection. If this is the end of his story, he might have continued for a while to associate with a Protestant leader who was trying to sort of unite the whole non-Catholic Protestant spectrum, from radical to more magisterial, mainstream, what we think of today, Protestantism. And Schneider may have been one of the people traveling with that reformer for a while, but he may have returned after that person died into an Anabaptist community. Or perhaps those who published the collection in 1564 did not know that at some point Schneider had recanted. We just don't have enough documentation. Some of the records of the Passau imprisonment have been lost or destroyed. We do know that some died in prison, including Hans Betz, whose line started out the title of this talk. He died in 1537, but apparently no one was actually executed. But many remained in prison for at least 5 years. Werner Packel has provided what is probably the best English language account of the Philippites in his 1995 book, Hutterite Beginnings. In more recent scholarship, Martin Rothkegel pays particular attention to the distinctions among various Anabaptist groups in Moravia. And his conclusions about the nature of those distinctions sometimes differ from those that other slightly earlier scholars have developed. Though individual destinies are not known, we remember this group and some of its individuals well, thanks to this book of 53 songs, 50 of which continue as part of modern editions of the Ausbund. The book itself tells us a few things and leaves us to wonder about others. Most basically, we know that the people imprisoned at Passau apparently sang. Interestingly, in the record of the 1528 interrogations of the local Anabaptists in Passau, one specific comment is that we have no songs. Maybe that just meant they had no songs that they themselves had created, or maybe it meant that they didn't sing. But the people imprisoned in 1535 did sing. The preface of this work does not bother, as had been common in some of the early Reformation hymnals, to lay out a polemical defense of singing of spiritual songs. Instead, readers are called basically to repent of the evil ways of the world and to use these texts, singing of these texts, as encouragement. Each of the texts specifies a melody, some secular, some spiritual, suggesting a wide repertoire of collective melody memory among the prisoners. There's also evidence in the Hutterite colony that when the Philippites were, and the Hutterites, by the way, did not like the Philippites at all, but one thing they commented on them when they were expelled from Auschwitz is that they went into the field singing. So there may have, there was a singing community quite likely among the prisoners who happened to be gathered at the fortress. Here is an example of a melody and text first published in 1530, we believe by the Anabaptist martyr George Grunwald. Musicologists indicate that the melody fits a fairly common type used with ballads, but nonetheless treated as distinct. Both Grunwald's melody and text enjoyed widespread popularity in broad Protestant circles. In fact, I didn't check whether there are still German Protestant hymnals that include this, but this was a well-known text and melody in Lutheran hymnals for many, many generations. Our friend Hans Betz, who wanted wisdom, also knew this melody by the time he was imprisoned, so within 5 years of it being created, and wrote his own text for it in the Passau collection number 41, in today's Ausbund number 118, Wach auf, O Menschenkind, awake, awake, O human child. One mystery about the 1564 edition that has been solved recently is the question of where and by whom it was printed. We still don't technically know for whom it was printed, but we know by whom it was printed. Thanks to the wisdom of Ulrich Kopp, an expert in German printing in the later 16th century, we learned a few years ago that this book was printed in Frankfurt am Main by Georg Raab. I will illustrate for you a bit of the process that Kopp went through in identifying the printer. He sought to match the set of uppercase initials used by the printer in the 1564 Passau songs. And here you see two sets of uppercase vowels, A and E, and two uppercase consonants, M and N. On the left, the ones from the Passau songs, and the right, ones from a 1564 edition of Ovid. And the Ovid includes the indication of who printed the work. Here, in looking at the preface to both books, Kopp noted that the uppercase D used in the preface of the Vorrede of the Passau songs was different than the uppercase D used in the preface of the Ovid. And so he kept hunting just to make sure that he wasn't missing something. And in fact, in a Bible printed the next year, and you see that letter in blue there, that decorated D, he found exactly the D that had been used in the 1564 Passau songs. So with that, there seems to be strong confirmation that Raab was the printer. Raab himself is known to have printed previously at Pforzheim near Stuttgart, but came to Frankfurt in 1561. where he was an active printer, often in association with others until his death in 1580. One tantalizing piece of his biography was that in 1552, when his son Christoph, who later was a printer himself, was born, Rob was living in Zurich. We don't know, I have not seen any evidence that he may have worked for a period of time with the famous Zurich printer Froschauer, whose printing was used not so much to print Anabaptist works, but to print particularly the Bible, the Zurich translation that was popular among Anabaptists for generations later. Rob also owned a paper mill in Alsace, 200 miles from Frankfurt. Although, as we determined during the conservation process, there are a few pages of the Passau songs that have watermarks, a little mark in the paper. That watermark is an ox head with a cross on its forehead, and that was an exceedingly common watermark in the era, so we can't use it to distinguish from other paper necessarily. And although Rob may have been involved in the printing of at least 4 works by Sebastian Frank, a sort of unaffiliated reformer with some radical leanings, his known printing career consists overwhelmingly of mainstream and orthodox works in both German and Latin. How he came to print this remains unknown to us. But it's significant to know, for example, that this book was not printed in Switzerland, which we might guess from the title, and where many later editions of the Ausbund would be printed, although probably not that of 1583 or even the 1622. It was also not printed at Cologne, which happens to have been a center of other German language Anabaptist printing of the mid to late 16th century. In returning to our map, I'll mention at least briefly a bit of conundrum and scholarly kerfuffle about now why would the Swiss brethren be identified on that title page? If you'll recall, the Philippites were caught in Passau and were likely headed back to their homes in that blue area. Switzerland is down in the yellow, so why were these called the Swiss brothers? There's not enough documentation to come up with secure knowledge, but most scholars, including people like Werner Packel and Arnold Snyder, point to threads of evidence that might be interpreted as indicating that the Philippites, after returning from Moravia, likely assimilated into other Anabaptists of nearby regions in their home communities. As time progressed, the diverse groups may have begun to coalesce into fewer groups, and in the case of the earlier Philippites, merging identities with those known as the Swiss Brethren. Issuing a collection of hymns and identifying its group origin must have been somewhat generally understood to its audience in 1564, even if we need to puzzle over it a bit today. Knowing that we no doubt have a few fans of the Zurich or Froschauer Bible translation present, I did want to call attention to the verse on the title page of the 1564 edition. Whoever chose this verse for the title page clearly was a user of the Zurich rather than the Luther translation. Zurich chose to follow the Septuagint or Greek numbering of the Psalms, in this case, the 139th Psalm, whereas Luther would have followed what, as most English language Bibles do, the more familiar Hebrew number, the 140th Psalm. And the phrasing is also unmistakably that of Zurich. For instance, the proud is die Stolzen instead of die Hoffärtigen, which Luther had used. Before the printer of this book was identified, I considered the psalm verse to be at least a thin clue suggesting it may have been printed in Switzerland. I am not aware of other cities at this time that printed copies of the Zurich translation, but I do know that when Rob, the printer of the 1564 Passau songs, printed Bibles, he printed the Luther translation, not the Zurich translation. So the editors chose this, not Rob himself. I promised you some information on other 16th century Anabaptist hymnals. The challenge that faces us, as mentioned earlier, is that so few copies of any of these exist today. Other than the 1583 Ausbund, which has perhaps 10 extant copies. The other known German language collections, like the 1564 Passau songs, exist only in single copies. If you were wondering how this group of 53 Passau hymns survived the quarter century or so between 1535 or 1540, when many people were released from the Passau prison, how they survived without being printed, we just have, the answer is apparently some of them were printed. That the preface tells us that. We just have no known surviving copies. The 1564 preface explains that, quote, until now, never have all of the hymns been printed, rather only some of the hymns have been printed. The phrasing to me suggests that there must have been more than one group printed. You may or may not be acquainted with Robert Rial's very useful translation and annotation of all of these Passau hymns in a volume entitled The Earliest Hymns of the Ausbund, as published by Pandora Press. I recommend it highly, but note that there is an extensive unpublished work that includes other things that Rial considered as he was studying this. And included in there is Rial's speculation, giving some good reasoning, but no way to test the hypothesis, that there were probably at least two different groups of Passau hymns, and he identified which ones he considered to be in a collection with each other, published 1564. Other than the statement in the 1564 preface, there are a few other possible clues to earlier distribution of at least Passau hymns. Hutterite manuscripts, certain Hutterite manuscripts identify some of these hymns as being written by specific individuals, even if those individuals are not named in either the 1564 or the 1583 editions. Although these Hutterite manuscripts, the oldest ones that we have, seem to date from much later, from the early 1600s, and it seems pretty clear that their transcription of Ausbund hymn texts, including the Passau hymns, rely heavily on the 1583 Ausbund, it seems that they may have had some other knowledge also of these hymns. One speculation is that some of these hymns may actually have been circulating in Moravia prior to the imprisonment, but by some of the people who were imprisoned. Another clue is that in the late 1550s, Peter Wiedemann, who was one of the most prolific Hutterite hymn writers, seems to have made his own adaptation of one of the Passau texts. So before this 1564 collection existed, he knew another text that is included and was able to do his own riff on that. And then we have very little pieces of evidence that very likely represent the pre-1654 circulation, but not, in my opinion, enough to qualify for those printings that the preface seems to suggest. Here again is our friend Hans Betz's song, Wach auf, a Menschenkind. This was published as a separate pamphlet. Although undated, it likely appeared in the mid-1550s, again, a decade before this 1564 volume. This particular text seems to have enjoyed continued popularity in pamphlet form outside of Anabaptist circles, and it's included in both known streams of the German language Anabaptist hymnals. The second stream I'm going to come to shortly. I wish we knew the individuals and circumstances behind the editing of the early Dutch and German language hymnals that, based on their content, must have been used by Anabaptists, though perhaps not exclusively. Just as this hymn by Betz was used outside of Anabaptist circles, other 16th century hymnals draw on that spectrum of hymn texts that seems to have been broader than the specific target group. This 1564 Passau collection is actually a notable exception to that, in that it seems to be focused on the Swiss brethren. Here, although in a later edition, is the title page of what was most likely the earliest collection of Anabaptist hymns. And this was a series of hymnals in the Dutch language, which began appearing in the early 1550s. And certainly by the middle and end of that decade, the new songs that were being added to this collection of various songs composed from the Old and New Testaments were largely Anabaptist, accounts often of martyrs. And that's also a way we try to date them based on which martyr account is being included and which ones are added in the next edition, sort of get the picture of when they may have appeared. Some were printed in Friesland in the west at Franeker, or in the east in Emden in what is now considered Germany. But already by around 1556, an edition was likely printed at Cologne, Germany, some 200 miles south of the Frisian cities, and as I mentioned at the time, a center of Anabaptist printing. It was also in Cologne in the mid-1550s that a German language collection was printed for the first time. And here we have what we lovingly call the Vatican Ausbund. It's only been about 20 years now that we have recognized that this hymnal, with the very familiar title, first word of the title, is not in the series. I mean, Rudolf Volkan in the early 20th century knew this book existed. He had no idea what was in it. It was in the Vatican. He didn't travel. He didn't have a way to do it. This is a photocopy from a microfiche of that, so it's a little murky, but anyway, although this has the word Ausbund in the title, the contents of it do not fit in the stream of either the 1564 Passau songs or the 1583 Ausbund. And when we look at the content, all of a sudden we recognize it as being the first in the series of editions that we knew of earlier called the schöne Gesangbüchlein. We don't know why the word Ausbund was dropped after the first edition and why that word Ausbund then appears in the other stream of hymnals in 1583. Here are just a few things to say about this whole series of schöne Gesangbüchlein hymnals. At its beginning, it clearly modeled itself on the Dutch Velderhande Liedeken series. In fact, the preface to the known editions in this series is taken very directly from the preface of the Mennonite editions of Velderhande Liedekens. You may recall that the Passau preface seems primarily concerned with exhortation of faithful living in an evil world and the role that songs can play in encouraging the faithful. The preface for this series focuses more on the right spirit to use when singing, making sure that you sing more with the heart than with the mind. From its beginning, it included martyr songs, accounts of people killed for their faith. Although the Passau songs were composed in prison, none of them narrate a martyr's death. The 1583 Ausbund, of course, does include martyr songs in its first part, including several that are in this stream of hymnals. The editors of this compilation included a good number of songs that either are known to have been or seem to have been translated from the Dutch. This suggests that the editors of this series of hymnals were at a place where there's substantial interaction with Dutch-speaking Anabaptists. And I'm going to have to wing the rest. I see that I'm missing some pages, but I'll go forward from here. So this is the title of the second edition in this string. Again, all of these 5 are undated, and so we organize them by what they have in them. And we think, based on the content, that this collection was published 1563-65, somewhere in there. So it's right about the same time as this book over here. One thing is that the content between the first and second edition of this stream changes quite a bit. They take out almost 30 songs from the first edition and replace those and add a few more in the second edition. So there was a radical, somebody was reworking that collection substantially. In the later editions, the third through fifth editions, very few deletions of hymns and just expansion of hymns. Here's a quick overview of those Gesangbuchlines and a little idea of how they grew over time and where they fit chronologically and where those single copies are held. I should say that the numbers on this slide are somewhat tentative. I realized as I was working with my spreadsheet of these things that I had in some cases not gone back to totally check against the full copies that we have in facsimile of each of these to make sure I had caught every hymn. I'd worked primarily from the indexes, which sometimes are incorrect. So that first Ausbund from the Vatican, we call that, by the way, because it is located in the Bibliotheca Palatina that was taken from Germany during the 30 Years' War from Heidelberg and has been part of the Vatican Library ever since. The second one, the only known copy, as I mentioned, it's a radical re-editing of the first hymnal. And it was probably printed in the early mid-1560s. The only known copy exists in Trier in the city library there. Then the Hutterites, bless their hearts, saved a copy of the third edition. Its title page is missing, but it's stayed in Slovakia at a time when some Hutterites moved further on to Romania, Hungary, later to the Ukraine. And it was there confiscated in 1760 from re-Catholicized Hutterite families and survives in the cathedral chapter, what was the cathedral chapter library in Bratislava. Then thoroughly documented but no longer extant was an edition that was in Berlin and was destroyed in World War II in bombing, probably printed in the 1570s and 80s. And then the final edition, which we know was in Berlin, was taken to Moscow after World War II and still, as far as we know, remains there, although we've never been able to, no one has been able to get a copy of that or lay our eyes on it. But that was the longest and final edition of this stream. We know that in the end, in that final edition, Leonard Klock, who comes into great prominence in Dutch hymnody, but is also very critical for the Ausbund edition as the composer or the author of the Loblied that is sung at every Amish worship service. He was almost surely the editor of that final edition. Almost all the songs are his songs, and this is right at the time when he is moving from German, we believe, moving from German-speaking territory to Dutch-speaking territory. After this point, Leonard Klock, who had earlier printed some pamphlets that included German translations of his songs, we no longer find no longer find German pamphlets with his songs. He goes exclusively to Dutch, and he was editing the Felderhande Liedekens also at this time. And I think he gave up the German project perhaps, and that might explain part of why this stream died out. So I want to leave just a little time for questions if possible, but another comment to make on this overall series and going back to the tradition that includes the Passau songs. In 1583, when that first volume in this tradition is published, the editors very clearly state that their purpose is not to speak to a specific group or represent a specific group, but to represent Christian belief, but Christian belief broadly. And so they consciously selected a variety of songs. All of these, though, because of their continued passing down through the tradition, today we think of them as sort of belonging to the Old Order Amish, which they do through use. But we should remember that in their conception, this collection had a almost progressive intent, and it included those Passau songs, but the Passau songs, when they were published, had a very narrow focus, and they broadened these with an equal or slightly greater number of hymns from some Anabaptists, some from other traditions. Well, I thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer questions that you may have. Thanks. Okay.
Do you have a thought on the group there in Passau while they were at the house? What kind of method was used to either write, compose music and songs? How did it get out of there?
So the question is whether I have any ideas about how what methods the prisoners in Passau might have used to write and compose some of the songs and then pass them further. So at one level, no, but it was, they were clearly working in a very oral tradition of learning and using song text. And everybody in that era was busily learning new songs because they were using songs that had never been written before. And so they likely entered prison already with some experience in learning songs. And as I mentioned, the melodies were not ones they invented. So they had a repertoire of melodic content that then they could put words to, different words that expressed what they were thinking. Some of those songs are indicated that they're sort of group projects where different people write different verses. As Elam knows, and as others who may visit the Oberhaus would find out, we don't really know for sure where in that complex and how in that complex the prisoners were kept. We, of course, have our mental image of the dark dungeon, and that may have been true or may have been intermittently true. But with that size of a group, might they have been conscripted to labor in fields? And so they might have had quite a bit of association with each other during that time. And if you're singing while you work, you can practice such things. It's the bigger mystery to me is really that preservation that allowed this 1564 group to be printed because the things had been written down. And some of the texts are not the most refined, but they make a great deal of sense. And so it's not like they are loosely remembered. They're clearly documented. And again, we have the evidence that at some point, at least some of them were printed. But whether that happened through passing out of manuscripts or taking with, once they were released, manuscripts, we don't really know. Sort of multiple possibilities there. Yes?
Are any of the songs sung today to the tunes that they would use then? Have any of those tunes survived?
So the question is, any of the songs being sung today use the same tunes? So there are very interesting studies on modern Amish singing. I'm hoping I'm saying this person's name right. Johan Folkel wrote a dissertation a number of years, not very many years ago, I think at University of Maryland, and helps talk about what goes into a melody of Amish singing today. we would not hear the melody of those notes that were printed in that O kommst du her, when we listen to any singing of an Ausbund tune today. That melody could be in the background of that, but we would not recognize it as such. And part of it is that the style that the Amish have used to pass these songs along is not focused, and I'm sorry I can't use the correct musicological terms for this. Maybe Hedda can help me out. But they are not singing in a metrical up and down note way. They're using the melody in a far different way than what I reading notes on a page would use. And it is both an oral O and an oral AU are a heard tradition, as Dr. Fulkel mentions in her book, in her dissertation. There are some, and Rose Elder's book is here too, but that in the last 30 or 40 years, there's also been sort of a growth of the use of what they call Notenbuch, that transcribe notation for the songs that are most often sung, and sometimes they'll provide alternate notation, or the Notenbuch in Iowa might be different from the Notenbuch in Lancaster County, but they're using that in a way to train some of their strongest singers in sort of keep a bit of uniformity, since they're not always listening to each other across those distances, that they are learning a common content, a common group of songs. Hedda.
I think one feature of Amish singing today, and as it has evolved over a long time, is based on their theology of the very first Ausbund in the expanded edition, Ausbund hymn, which is a popular hymn, which frowns upon the use of instruments. Instruments cannot proclaim the praise of God in any form or shape or way. Only the human voice with words can do that. And so they oppose the use of instruments. They also, that also meant they had no leader, instrumental or otherwise, who kept them moving. The memory of folk ballads, which were the melodies that the people were singing for any kind of occasion, work songs, wedding songs, what have you. That faded over time, particularly when you are living in an enclave as exclusive as the early Anabaptists did, because they had to separate themselves from the world. So, non-directed singing, fading memory, trying to reconstruct the melodies, slowed the singing down and the memory with it. What happened, I thought, the great pioneer American ethnomusicologist, George Pullen Jackson, who lived in the 1930s and who wrote numerous books on American white and black spirituals and folk songs in Appalachia, etc., knew some of those songs, some of those groups very intimately, a particular group of Black Baptists somewhere in the South. And they sang similar to what the Amish sing today, or in his time when he did his field trips, and he called it a surge singing. Once they had gotten the tone, then it surged forward, you know, it's a surge of music. He also, and since it was very slow, there were tones and notes and syllables that were drawn out. And between the first memory of the first note and the target note and the end of it, there was much time to fill. And the song leader, and George, I'm not making this up, George Pullen Jackson gave me the best description of that process. He said, imagine a drunk Appalachian man coming home at night, trying to find the keyhole for his key to get into the house. And finally he got it. That's the first note. And then when he finds that note, and he creates the connection through so-called ornamentation, or as the Baroque practice was called diminution, like chopping up into little notes instead of one long sustained note. It became the song leader, and being a leader and being the best one with the best memory and the loudest voice, he set the pattern, which then became doctrine, which then became the way of singing that particular interval or that particular song. And I was very interested in that because I lived in Huntingdon, next door to the valley where Joe Yoder grew up. And Joe Yoder was an Amish man who became Mennonite, and because his parents wanted him to have an academic education, which he did. And he saved by listening and transcribing from hearing those still extant. I mean, he visited old members of the Amish community and had them sing for him the songs they remembered, the hymns and songs. And he wanted to fix the tradition. That was his goal. And he wrote it down in shape music because they were holier than the round ones. And he wanted to learn everybody all the Amish people in Indiana, in Kansas, everywhere, to learn that and be able to sing the lobe sung the same way in all the other hymns that were so important and dear. And so he wanted to fix it. It didn't really work. But that was the idea. You know, you have to fix it. And people like me, who cannot improvise on the piano or any other instrument, I'm fixed to the page. I can only sight read and translate to the keyboard. Whereas the folk singers, they invent, they make diminutions, they make improvisations. And that's what happens when you have an oral tradition without leadership, without support by an instrument. And that holds you together, you know, and keeps you moving. And so I cannot forget George Pullen Jackson's keyhole.
I apologize to those.
I'll add one footnote. When the first big Amish conference was held here, Don and I were connected with the Young Center, and I looked at the, you won't believe that, Joe, but I looked at the proposed conference for the whole week or whatever it was, 4 days. And there was not one presentation about the singing. I am not a musicologist, I'm a hymnologist who deals with the text and the relationship to the music. But I thought, that is just too bad. And with the consent of Don Cravel and my Don and whoever else was on the committee, I got it in. And I compared the dissertation I mentioned to you at the table, who took Yoda and took a group in the Shishkawana in northern Indiana and a group in Kansas, and had them sing the same hymns, and we, the candidate for the dissertation, the doctor, wrote everything, recorded everything. He had better means than Joe Yoda did. He had only his hearing, but he made recordings. And I compared all of those and the intervals that they were covering. And you know, they were very similar because they were natural combinations. Only the speed in which they were combined was a little different. And what sent me off was the attendance at one of the Eastern Mennonite, Old Order Mennonite hymn sings with Amos Hoover. And I had no problems with those hymns because I could anticipate where they were going because I had done Baroque music before. And you know, and those are the natural connections between long notes, between notes at distances from each other. And it was in the air, it was in their culture, whether they knew it or not. It was in their ears. So that's a long answer.
Well, thank you. I apologize to those who are participating by Zoom. You've missed a very interesting and informed discussion or explanation of some of the evolution of melody in an oral, non-directed tradition. So, Steve, should I turn it back to you?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for your presentation this evening. Joe will continue exploring Anabaptist hymnody with us in the Durnbaugh seminar tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I invite you to join us all for the Durnbaugh seminar. No pre-registration is required. Just come and learn. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. to noon, not in this space, but at the Young Center building at 10 a.m. Joe will offer a presentation and discussion on early Anabaptist hymnody. What do we want to learn? We'll consider questions such as, can we better determine who used which texts or melodies and how? How did hymns spread geographically and across language groups? What musicological resources provide new documentation or insights today? So please join us tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for that presentation and discussion at the Young Center. And as I mentioned earlier this evening, in about 2 weeks on April 5th at 7 p.m., our Curator Fellow lecturer, Jonathan Steyer, our 2022 Curator Fellow, will speak on the unknown story of the naming of the Brethren in Christ. And this is a story focused, especially in the 19th century, includes some references to the American Civil War and the evolution of names in the River Brethren in Christ tradition. April 5, Tuesday evening, 7 p.m. at the Young Center. Closing, I want to thank our IT staff here for live streaming this program. Thanks to Elizabethtown College for its support of the Young Center, and thanks to all of you for your interest and support of our work. Safe travels home to all of you. Have a good evening.